you know.
Yeah, we are live in Lawyers Wit.
Yeah, you guys are live.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Talveen Singh Nanda. I'm a practicing advocate and the founder of Lawyers World Group. We are proud to present season 2 of the Lawyers World lecture series. Today's webinar is brought to you in collaboration with the Virtual Lawyer. Over the course of this month, we will be conducting a number of webinars on all relevant topics of law. I am proud to present today's webinar on the topic customary law and its modern implications with a special reference to intellectual property rights by our keynote speaker, Ms. Janvi Sharma, advocate practicing at Delhi High Court. Now I would request Divya Bisht to give a formal introduction of our keynote speaker. Divya.
Good morning, everyone. Janvi Sharma is a third-generation practicing advocate at the Supreme Court of India. She specializes in intellectual property rights, law, constitutional law, international relations, and diplomacy and family law. She is also a mediator. She is skilled in drafting, arguing, and legal research. She does a fair share of legal advisory and consultancy work for a number of individuals, companies, educational institutions, and organizations. With a background in political science honors from Hindu College Delhi University, she is also an avid reader who writes poetry occasionally. She is also closely attached to the Virtual Lawyer Instagram handle, which is an initiative to enhance virtual legal education through live sessions. Till now, it has conducted over 65 live sessions and webinars. Now, I would like Janvi ma'am to enlighten us with her words.
Thank you, Divya. Thank you for that introduction. It was very sweet, very nice of you. Today's session, first of all, I would like to thank everyone who is tuned in today to hear us at 8 p.m. I understand that this is your dinner time, and we hope that, we could impart a little bit of legal education along with your evening siestas, and, it's something different from like primetime television. So today's topic is customary law, its modern implications, and a special reference to intellectual property rights law. Now, before we start with the session, what are customs? Customs are something that we see in our everyday life. We perform customs day to day, whether we know it or not. They are there in every household, every community, every locality, and every country. So if you look at personal laws, how marriage is conducted, like in Hindus, you have the Saat Feras. In Muslim weddings, you have the Kabul hai, so all of this is custom. You have the Karwa Chauth where the wife asks for the husband. In Hindus, women wear sindoor, Mangal Sutra. In yoga, you do the Surya Namaskar, you do pranayam. Sometimes there is laughter therapy that you see in parks, or used to see before we had the lockdown. Now, some of the very infamous festivals, customary festivals in India include the Nag Panchami, which is basically the festival of snakes. There is a Tantric fertility festival, which is very prevalent in Assam. There is the Kumbh Mela, which is very, very, widely covered throughout the country in the media and everywhere else. And, a large number of people actually go there for pilgrim purposes. And then we have a lot of customs also in our food. Like, for example, the Punjabis are associated with butter chicken, Bengalis with rasagulla, then Kashmiri food is out of the world. You associate that with the region, you associate South Indian with South India. So this is how customs work. But just because we have customs does not mean that each custom has the force of law. Customary law only deals with customs that have the force of law. Now, in order to determine them, there are several tests, especially judicial tests. I will come to those tests in a while. Today's webinar focuses on the modern implications of customary law. Now, what are the modern implications, right? So, I broadly am covering 3 modern implications of customary law. The first being religion, the second being gender, and the third being intellectual property rights. Now, we've all heard of the infamous Shaira Bano case. It's Shaira Bano versus Union of India. This was the case which was widely reported in the media, and it was a landmark judgment. It struck down triple talaq. Now, the thing is that in this particular case, one of the major issues that the Supreme Court dealt with was that of custom, was that of essential practice. So the question was that whether triple talaq constitutes an essential practice to Islam. And if it does, it cannot be altered because essential practice to a religion cannot be altered. But if it is other than essential practice, then there is a possibility of addition, subtraction, or alteration. Now, in this particular judgment, there was a minority opinion that said that triple talaq is an essential practice to Islam and is aided by the provisions of the Constitution. The majority opinion said that it is an invalid custom, that it is not, it does not amount to customary law. And there were several submissions. One was of the nature that said that no undesirable practice can be conferred the status of an essential practice. Then what is meant by essential practice? So what was defined in this judgment was that the core beliefs of a particular religion constitute essential practice. These beliefs should be of such a nature that without these beliefs, without this essential practice, the entire religion itself would fail, and that religion would be no religion. So it said that it is upon the cornerstone of essential practices that the superstructure of a religion is built, and without which the religion will be no religion. Now, the test to determine whether a practice is an essential practice to a religion is to find out whether the nature of the religion will be changed if any change is brought about to that practice. Another aspect is that in taking away the practice, there would be a fundamental change in the character of the religion. Now, no additions or subtractions are possible to such a fundamental practice. It is in these permanent and essential parts of a religion that the Constitution provides protections, and any other part is not protected by the Constitution of India. Now, there is another case law, and that is of Sabrimala. However, that is now sub judice as it is pending final adjudication in the court. The case is called Indian Young Lawyers Association versus State of Kerala, and the judgment, which has now been challenged and is being reviewed, it dealt with the issue of women being allowed to enter temples, and especially menstruating women. So this is a very interesting case, as it shows how customs overlap with gender, religion, caste, creed, and any local or indigenous practice. So it'll be very interesting to find out what is the final outcome of this particular case. Another case that I can share with you is the Commissioner Hindu Religious Endowments, Madras versus Sri Lakshmindra Tritha Swayamnar of Sri Shirur Mutt. Now, the citation is 1954 SCR 1005. Now, in this judgment, it states that what constitutes essential practice of a religion is primarily to be ascertained with reference to the religion's doctrines itself. So basically, if you're trying to figure out what is a custom or what is an essential practice in a religion, you have to analyze the doctrines of that particular religion. In this case, dealt with aspects such as offerings. So when we go to temples, we offer prasad. Sometimes we give donations. Sometimes we buy, little baskets to offer to the god. Sometimes milk. Sometimes mithai or something of that sort. So this case dealt with that because that has an economic character. However, it is written in the tenets that these offerings, certain offerings, are supposed to be given to the gods. So therefore, they constitute essential practice. Now, another case law is that of the Commissioner of Police and others versus Acharya Jagdish Varananda. So in this case, the test of essential practice was stated. Now the test, it says, lies with the community perception, how the community regards the practice. Also, the nature of the essential practice must be religious. So how the community perceives whether it wants to follow this particular practice or not, whether it is, according to them, a valid practice, and secondly, it should have a religious nature. Now, I would like to talk a little bit about what is a valid custom and the judicial tests for a valid custom. There are about 4 or 5 main tests that the judiciary uses when determining a valid custom. First test is that a custom should be in use since times immemorial. This means that no person living today should be able to trace back the first instance when that particular custom started. So this is different from folklore. Like we all have folklores, we all have stories that our ancestors tell us, some practice started like this, some practice started like that. That's all right. But no person living today should be able to attest to the fact that they were there or that they know someone who was there when this practice started. Now, another test is reasonableness. Now, when we say reasonableness, we mean reasonable as seen by a layman. So, however, a layman will understand the concept of reason and reasonableness is what is the test. So, the custom should not be opposed to fundamental principles of morality. The custom should be useful. The custom should be convenient for the society. It should not damage or disturb impressionable minds, and it should not cause mischief. Now, a case law for this is Ravi Verma versus Raja Verma. Now, this is a very interesting case. What happened was that this family, joint family, they owned the trusteeship of a religious endowment. And one of them wanted to sell that trusteeship in order to gain money. Basically, he wanted to sell it for monetary gain. And he said to the court that this is a matter of custom. I mean, this is customary. We've been doing it for years. So why should I not be allowed to do this? So the court said that selling a trusteeship for monetary gain is illegal, and it is not reasonable, and therefore it is not a valid custom. Another case was that of Lakshmi Put Singh versus Sadola Nusho, ILR 9 CAL 698. Now, in this, a zamindar who had a big estate was upset because there were fishermen who were trying to fish from his pond, and they would come and they would, fish from his pond and they would leave. Now, the fishermen said that, it's our custom. We've been doing it for years and we should be allowed to continue to do this. The court struck it down and they said that no, the zamindar has a right to enjoy his property, and therefore this is of the nature of trespass and is not allowed. Another aspect of another test of a valid custom is that of morality. It should not be immoral. A case law is Mathura Nathkin versus Isu Naikin, 1880 ILR 4 BOM 545. So this is the Bombay High Court judgment in which the court said that adoption of young girls for immoral purposes, such as dancing, is not a valid custom. Another case, the court also held that marriage with daughter's daughter is not a valid custom and therefore is not under the purview of customary law. Continuance is a very important aspect while judging a custom. Basically, continuance means that the custom should have been in practice continuously since the time that it started. Now, Blackstone says that discontinuation of a right, no matter for how small a period of time, is the end of a valid custom. So this is what we follow. Other tests include peaceful enjoyment, public policy, juridical nature, compulsory observance, not by analogy. Now, another very important test of valid custom is that of consistency. So Article 13.1, Clause 1 of our Constitution reads as follows. It says, all laws in force in the territory of India immediately before the commencement of the Constitution, insofar as they are inconsistent with the provisions of this part, shall, to that extent, and to the extent of the said inconsistency, be void. So basically, it's talking about laws in force, them being inconsistent with the Constitution, and therefore to the extent of that inconsistency being void. Okay. Now, Article 13, Clause 3, Clause 3, Part A says that a law includes any ordinance, any order, bylaw, rule, regulation, notification, custom, and usage, having the territory, having in the territory of India the force of law. Force of law is defined in Part B, and force of law is stated as laws being passed by or made by the legislature or other competent authority in Indian territory before the commencement of the constitution, but not previously repealed, notwithstanding that any such law or any part thereafter may not be then in operation either at all or in a particular area. Now, so this is very interesting. I will tell you a case law of Bombay High Court. This case is called State of Bombay versus Narasu Appa Mali. Citation is AIR 1952 BOM 84. So this was a very landmark judgment at the time, and it's still in force. Basically, this judgment dealt with polygamy. It dealt with the question of personal laws vis-a-vis Article 13, Clause 1 of the Constitution, as well as Article 15. So the discussion was of this nature. They spoke about how customs for every religion are different, and they come under the ambit of personal law. And personal law should not be included in Article 13. Okay, this was one school of thought. The other school of thought said that personal law is the same as custom and usage. And since in Article 13, custom and usage is used, so by interpretation, personal laws also are covered in the ambit of the Constitution. Now, the court dealt with this issue, and the court held that personal laws are not covered in the ambit of Article 13(1). There were a number of submissions made. One of the submissions was that if our constitution makers wanted to include personal laws, they would have said so expressly, and the omission of the fact that the term personal laws is not there in Article 13 Clause 1 means that they wanted to exclude it. Now, and also the court held that polygamy did not offend Article 15 Clause 1, and it did not discriminate on the basis of gender. Now, this was that judgment. I recently came across, actually not recently, a while back, but I came across this article in the Hindu. It was on 20th September 2018. The article was titled, "With Sabrimala Verdict, the Ghost of Narasu is Finally Exorcised." So in this, they quoted Justice Chandrachud's separate opinion in the judgment, which is now, in court. So we'll have to await the ultimate decision. But the opinion read as follows. Reasoning given in the Narasu Appa Mali judgment of the Bombay High Court in 1951 is based on a flawless premise. Immunizing customs and usage, like the prohibition of women in Sabrimala, takes away the primary of the constitution. Immunity given to personal laws, customs, deviates from the vision of social transformation. Constitution has inherently a transformative vision, and the restricting definition of the term laws in force detracts from that vision. Now, those activities that are inherently connected with civil states of the individual cannot be granted constitutional immunity merely because they may have some features which have a religious matter. So now we'll have to ultimately see what happens, but this is what the discussion was all about. Now, if we move on from religion to a role of women. Now, the thing is, I have to say this, that in India, we have very good laws for women. Laws in India, customary laws and laws otherwise, have developed immensely in the favor of women. There was a time when widows could not be remarried. Then we had the Widow Remarriage Act. There was a time when women could not own property, and now we had the amendments to the Hindu Succession Act. There were right to equality, right to equal pay, right to work. There are so many different movements that are happening in the legal system of India, which are helping the women. However, in India, the problem in the modern context, the problem with gender is that women often find a challenge, and the challenge is of the nature that they are unable to exercise their rights as individuals in their social context. So we have to understand the fact that in India, women, there is a parallel social system and there is a parallel political system running to the legal system that is already in place. So women as individuals in the social systems that they are a part of find it very difficult to exercise the rights that have been conferred on them with the help of the legal system. Now, how to manage this in a modern context, how to help them in a modern context? There is a model, a three mechanism model. The first talks about recognition, second is retribution, and third is acknowledgement. So recognition will be of the nature that you can appoint and look out for spokespersons and representatives from the local communities. These can then be trained to talk to women, to initiate dialogue, and to help at a lower grassroots level. Retribution can be in economic, social, or political way. You can give them better impetus, better education, better opportunities, maybe even scholarships. NGOs and civil societies, as well as various organizations, have a huge role to play in this particular mechanism. The third mechanism is that of acknowledgement. Now, acknowledgement can be given through featuring them, giving them prizes, giving them scholarships, sort of making them feel reciprocated every time they take a step. So this would be the role of women in a modern context, in a customary law context. I would now like to go on to intellectual property rights. Now, the thing with intellectual property rights is that it is a very new law, not just in India, but throughout the world. And it is still developing, and it still has a long way to grow and develop. What is IPR? I mean, you may ask that. So IPR by definition is all the property that we create using the creativity of our minds. So all the creative minds, what they do and the work they create is what comes under the ambit of IP. Now, it could be in literary work, it could be in artistic work, it could be a trademark, it could be an invention. The protections that are awarded in the form of rights are called copyright, trademark, and patents. Now, in India, we see a lot of diversity. Almost every 2,000 miles when we go, we see a different dialect, we see a different tradition, we see a different set of probably food that we eat will be different, the clothes that we see will be different. So that means that India is a storehouse of traditional knowledge. What is traditional knowledge? Traditional knowledge is knowledge which is developed in indigenous, local, or native communities, knowledge which is preserved, knowledge which is passed on from generation to generation, so much so that it ends up becoming the identity of that particular community. Now, as a result, it is our impetus and it is our duty to protect this intellectual property of traditional knowledge. There are two types of protections. One is positive protection and second is negative protection. Positive protection happens through the role of governments, through the role of NGOs, through the role of regulatory bodies, and through judicial decisions, right? So this would be enacting laws, rules, regulations, and offering royalties when a particular IPR is used for monetary benefits. Negative protection will be trying to prevent, the acquisition of IPR rights of small communities by people who don't have their best intentions in mind. So what happens is, mostly with big pharma and big companies, they acquire the rights of the traditional knowledge. The indigenous communities do not understand what IPR is. It's a very new law, and we are still developing the law in India. So they are unaware of what they're signing off. And they take their rights and they use them for monetary benefits, and the communities as a whole are rendered helpless. So as far as my personal opinion goes, I would feel that, as communities as a whole, we should provide them with royalties if something which is derived from their IP work actually gets monetary benefits. We should give them licenses, and they should be able to give their IPR on a license basis. Or we can have a contract with the leaders of a particular community, and they can sort of regulate the IP content that is going out. Of course, it could be just my wishful thinking, but that is what I feel should be done in IPR of traditional, when it comes to IPR relating to traditional knowledge. Now, it is therefore crucial to recognize and strengthen customary law, which may be relevant in the intellectual property system, and especially in safeguarding traditional knowledge of a community. IP laws in a country can help protect the customs of the country, and sometimes it is vice versa. The traditional in traditional knowledge is nothing but the existence of a custom. New and developing branch of customary law is IPR, and therefore we need to focus on this. Even though it's a new and developing branch, what it is protecting is an age-old knowledge system which we have inherited from our ancestors. Now, another aspect that I want to cover in IPR is, so India has a large number of indigenous population, okay? Especially in the Northeast, especially in some belts of South India, there are a number of indigenous pockets, communities and their pockets. So those communities require special protection by us. For example, the Khasi community in Meghalaya. So they, as villagers, own groves of trees, and that is seen as a common property. And no one is allowed to cut a tree unless it is for like a cremation purpose. They are not allowed to touch those trees. Then we have the Nishi tribe of Arunachal Pradesh. So they hunt a bird called the hornbill, and they use its beak to make a headgear. However, they are aware that they cannot hunt it to a point of extinction. So they have a customary ban. Now, this ban has been going on for generations, where in an entire mating season, they make sure that no one hunts the bird. Right? So these are some practices which we get from our customs, and which I feel should be followed, and should be emphasized more and should be protected more. In order for any modern development to take place, local customs need to be protected alongside. There needs to be a balance maintained, and all stakeholders are crucial to this process. In Indian communities, it is generally believed that knowledge is something that needs to be given freely and across the community. They also believe that the knowledge increases with its multiplication, and therefore it is our imperative to protect this. Now, one of the examples of IPR protection is Section 3P of the Patents Act of 1970. Now, this section reads as follows. It states that an invention which is in effect which in effect is traditional knowledge, or which is an aggregation or duplication of knowledge, known properties, or traditionally known component or components, is not patentable. So in India, you cannot get a patent on something that is based on traditional knowledge. Another act which traditional knowledge, now see, this is the positive aspect of traditional knowledge. What happens is that sometimes there are some negative connotations. For example, you see advertisements where people are saying, we'll give you a magical remedy, and your diabetes will be cured, or we have a magical cure for kidney stones, or for in Indian societies, a lot of couples want a son, so they go to Babajis, and those Babajis say that we'll give you one goli and you'll have a son, or you'll have two sons, or those kind of things. So there is an act called the Drugs and Magical Remedies Objectionable Advertisements Act of 1954. Now, this act basically applies to any advertisement of a drug where the person is claiming that they have a magical remedy and that they will cure a particular disease. This is a cognizable offense. I'll give you an example. So how Patanjali came up with they said they've come up with a vaccine for COVID, and they started advertising. So the moment they advertised, the Ayush Ministry, they sort of issued a notification and described the guidelines and the procedure through which a vaccine was to be developed in India. And they also stated that any advertisement of this kind would, invite or would be regulated by the Drugs and Magical Remedies Act. Now, apart from this, I want to talk to you about the fact that, sometimes when you're arguing a case, or when you're, especially if it's a matrimonial case or a property case, or, something related to personal laws, and you suddenly find yourself giving an argument which is customary in nature. So you have to prove a particular custom to prove your argument. So how do you do that? So in order to prove a custom in court, we have certain provisions of the Evidence Act of 1972, which you can use. Now, the first proof is that of, is proof by opinion. So basically, in this case, what happens is that you call a person who you feel would have the knowledge, would have the necessary know-how of a particular custom. Such a person has to be relevant to that particular custom, and they will come and give a testimony. Now, the thing is that such a person should be, should not be a interested party, should not have any vested interests, and should be open to giving this as an unbiased opinion. Now, the second could be proof by a dead person's testimony. So, in this case, basically, what you have to make sure is that the person who was giving the testimony, who is now deceased, must have given it in for the general public and as in a general context, and this should have been given before that particular custom came into any controversy. Another example is proof by by transaction. So basically, sometimes when we do certain transactions, we make a chain of events, and that can prove the validity of a custom, or maybe the practice of a custom, or the addition or subtraction to a particular custom. For example, we'll go to the market during Diwali and we'll buy Ganesh ji and Lakshmi ji ki photos and murtis. We'll buy flowers, we'll buy stuff to do puja with. So that is a transaction that will ultimately prove a chain of events that shows the practice of a custom. Apart from this, there is, of course, a case law which states that if there is a judicial precedent stating that you have already stating that that custom has already been declared as a valid custom, then you no longer have to prove it under the Evidence Act, under Section 51 of the Evidence Act. Now, I have spoken a lot about the Indian context of customary law, and I have given you a lot of examples of Indian case laws, but I would like to also tell you that customary law is not limited to India. There is a whole field of international customary law, and customs are considered as a major source for international law. And the International Court of Justice deals with a lot of cases where the issues at hand include customs. So I will highlight about 2 to 3 cases, which are my favorite cases. The first is that of Portugal versus India. Now, this is also known as the right of passage case. So what happened was, this is the 1954 case. Portugal submitted an application to the International Court of Justice. Now, you can approach the International Court of Justice in 2 ways. One, you can have an agreement between 2 parties where they both go to the court and say that, we accept your authority over us and that your jurisdiction over us is binding, and we accept that. Another way is that they have a unilateral character, and the unilateral character basically says that only one country will approach the court, and in this case, that is what happened. And Portugal said that we have a right of passage through our territories in Damau and to our enclaves in Dadar and Nagar Haveli. Now, they wanted a free right of passage, unfettered, and the passage would include people, goods, and armed services, and also military personnel. Now, India was actively blocking this, but in the court, in the ICJ, what was held was that the right of passage as a right and as a custom had been practiced between the 2 countries for over 150 years, and therefore it was a matter of regional custom. And so the right of passage was allowed, however, only limited to non-military personnel. So that is what the court decided. Now, another case is that of the North Sea Continental Shelf case. This is of 1969, and it is between 3 countries, Denmark, Netherlands, and Germany. So basically, the North Sea, if you look at it geographically, the North Sea is in the center, and Denmark and Netherlands and Germany are all around the North Sea. So the question was, how do we decide the boundaries of these 3 countries within the North Sea? Like, what is the process? So the process of deciding the boundaries that was in question was that of equidistance. So they should all be equally distant. Now, the court held that no, equidistance is not a customary process. It has not been used, since times immemorial. So you can choose whatever way you want, but you cannot force all the countries to use equidistance as a means to decide delimitation. Another case is that of is the asylum case. Now this is between Colombia and Peru. Now what had happened was that a Colombian embassy had given asylum to a Peruvian national, and this was a political asylum. And Peru basically approached the ICJ and they said that who gives the authority to Colombia to decide whether this is a criminal case or a political case? Because that national at that time was being accused of instigating a military rebellion. So Colombia said that, it's our customary right. We've been doing this for many years, so we should be allowed. The court shot it down and it said that you have not been doing this continuously for so many years. There have been breaks. And as Blackstone said, that, a break in a custom, no matter how small, ends a valid custom. So on that ground, they shot it down. So that is it from me today. Divya, I think you can give me any questions if you have.
Am I audible, ma'am?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, that was indeed an informative session, ma'am. So the questions we have is, what is the nature of customary law?
The nature of customary law.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So I will give you a few definitions of customary law that should probably help you understand what is the nature of customary law. I had written it down somewhere here. 1 second, I'll just look for it. Yeah. So a custom can be defined as behavior, as usage, as fashion, as tradition, ritual, ceremony, practice, or etiquette. Customary law can be defined as a social behavior followed by a large group of people for a very long time. It should be such a practice that if it were to be changed, it would take the willingness of all those people over that entire geographical area to change that particular practice. Blackstone defined customary law as law consisting of customs that are accepted as legal requirements, obligatory rules of conduct, practices, and beliefs that are so vital and intrinsic that the social economic systems treat them as laws, as if they were laws themselves. So basically there are 3 4 types of customs. There is a local custom which is in a particular area. There is a national custom which will be followed throughout the country, and there are conventional customs which are certain new age customs. Like for example, now we have this entire millennial wave. So millennial wave will also become a custom eventually. So all the new things that start coming up, they all start adding to customs.
Okay. Well, my next question is, how has customary law been recognized or applied in other areas such as family law of succession, etc.?
Yeah, so customary law most often is applied to family law and to personal laws. In fact, I read somewhere that a council was arguing that the wife was not wearing a sindoor or a mangal sutra in her marriage, so she was showing that she does not want to stay married. So what he was doing actually was trying to say that wearing a sindoor and a mangal sutra is a valid custom, and therefore, it is a valid argument. So that is one example. Another example could be what I heard was today, in fact, in a webinar, that in a particular case, the counsel for the husband was arguing, saying that the wife doesn't cook for me, so she should not, so I want to divorce her. Now he was saying that this is a matter of custom, that a wife should cook, and of course that has been a custom, for many years in India. So why not? But the court held that the wife was actually a doctor. So the court held that she is a doctor and she is doing so much work, so you cannot expect her to cook for you. It is no longer a valid custom in that sense of the term, and therefore it should not be applied. Another very interesting judgment is that of Justice Baziri. It's a landmark judgment. Basically, he held that a woman can be a karta, which now karta is traditionally something that only males have been in a family, in a Hindu, family, joint family. So after the amendments of the Hindu Succession Act, because a woman can now be a co-partner and claim rights in property. So by that definition, a woman can also be a karta. So those are some examples of how customs are, customary law sort of integrates within other laws.
Okay. My next question is, what relationship between customary law and IP law have been encountered in practice?
Okay. So, that's very interesting. So, people generally don't realize this, but a lot of work in IPR is actually stemming from customary law. For example, you have clothing lines that produce juttis, patiala suits, fulkari dupattas. So these are all traditional Punjabi attires. Then you have, the Lucknow ka chikankari work. You have the Pathani salwar or the Pathani suit, and you have there is an Assamese skirt called the dokhona. So that is now seen as a wrapper on, those wrap-ons that you get in stores very commonly these days. That's actually an Assamese dress. So it came from there. So therefore, IP I feel is integrated in, like, because it's just traditional knowledge, and that then suddenly becomes fashion and is picked up by designer wears or artists. Another example is that of songs. So, like you have you have these Punjabi songs, and they will suddenly become very famous, and you'll be listening to it, and your parents will be like, "ये तो हमारे ज़माने का गाना है." So basically, what the artist has done is they've taken a folklore or a very old, traditional village song, and they have sort of converted it into a modern song, which is very catchy. So that is where you have the IP implications of customs.
Okay, ma'am. Next question is, how does customary law function in the tribal society?
Yeah, so that's a very, very interesting question. And I'm so glad someone asked that, because actually, with indigenous knowledge, it is a very complex process. And I feel there are certain protections that are required over and above the regular protections that you get. I personally have this opinion that, we need to preserve our tribal community way more than we are at the moment. We need to sort of demarcate those communities, identify them. So tribal communities, generally each and every tribal community will have their own local system of functioning. They will have their local leaders, they will have their own dispute resolution procedures, and all of them will be different. So I think we need to integrate IP into that. We need to inform them of what is IPR, and as a community, they need to be protected against people misusing their traditional knowledge.
Okay, ma'am. The next question is, can existing IP laws provide protection for traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions?
Yeah, I think I've dealt with this in the session, right? So I've mentioned all of this.
Okay, ma'am.
Hanji. Next question.
Just a minute, ma'am.
I'm unaware of the time also.
Yes. Ma'am, I think that's enough for questions right now.
Okay. Thank you so much.
So, due to paucity of time, I would just hand over Parveen Nanda to provide vote of thanks now.
I must say that this was such an insightful session. I would like to thank our speaker, Ms. Janvi Sharma. I must make a mention that she took out time for this webinar, especially despite of her busy schedule. She had some prior commitments and she took out her time. I thank her for that. The manner in which she had explained such a complex topic is in such a simple way is commendable. And I'm sure our viewers, be it law students or the budding lawyers, must have gained so much from this webinar. I would like to thank our audience and Dr. Manjula Batta and the virtual lawyer. I would also like to thank our team, especially Divya and Govind Chaturvedi, for this wonderful webinar. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.